Ecclesiology, therefore, is based on a number of levels, including the difference between what is sign and what is symbol. Signs are univocal. They do not operate on the various levels of one's unconscious or in that deeper area of one's being that is non-cognitive. Signs, as it were, have a limited shelf life. A stop sign has one function. It tells you to stop. Now, I think it can become a symbol, but generally speaking, that's only when there's a flashing red light if you decide you don't like the sign. A symbol, on the other hand, is multivocal. Univocal, of course, from the Latin for one voice. Multivocal from the Latin for many voices, voce. But it comes from a lot of different levels. Meaning that when you look up there at that crucifix, that is not a sign. That is a symbol, because suddenly that begins to evoke in you multiple responses. It may be the first time you saw one. It may be thinking about what it is that Jesus won for you. It may very well be you saying, I don't like crucifixes, I like plain crosses. Or it may be you saying, you know, I really like the Christus Rex more. I mean, there are all sorts of things that crucifix will evoke in a person because it functions on a multivocal or symbolic level rather than on the level of univocal nature, one limited reality. Ecclesiology, if it is narrowly defined as being nothing other than the study of my church, is narcissistic. When an ecclesiology looks at itself with the following principles, then it has achieved the wider understanding, the prevailing understanding of ecclesiology. Number one, I am not the definition of the church. The church defines me. Two, I have been involved in ecclesial bodies that have either broken my heart or kicked me out. That was not the church. That was not ecclesiology. And there's a difference between being a denomination and being a communion. If I may look back for just a moment, when the Episcopal Church stopped thinking of itself as a province that was in interdependency with the worldwide Anglican communion and started functioning like an American Protestant denomination, is when it got in trouble. Because it determined that it had independence rather than interdependence. 3. That is, ecclesiology means being in communion with something or someone. Here we have a couple different points of view. There are some who say that doctrinal purity trumps incommunio sacris. The problem is how we define doctrinal purity. And the reason I put it that way is because I can sit around with a group of theologians and I can ask them to define doctrinal purity for me, and I will get as many opinions as I will theologians. I can also do that with Christians. Father Michael and I were at the airport, waiting to catch flight from DFW here, and a very zealous Roman Catholic who had had a conversion experience began to talk with us about how significant the Blessed Mother was as a deity. I'm not saying that that was purely a massive elevation, conceptually speaking, of what it means to be a co-redemptrix. I don't believe that his comments were on that particular level of debate, and it may have even been a mistaken word. But my point is that individual interpretation, or even a small interpretation of 2,000 years of ecclesiology is inherently destined to fail. So being in communion may carry with it situations that are awkward because we perceive that there is not doctrinal purity. But to be really honest with you, or blunt with you, I should say, I hope I've been honest, be more blunt with you, when I am engaged in the ecumenical work that I've been engaged in, primarily with Eastern rites, the first thing that does not come up is the filioque. That's not the first thing that comes up. Reality is how all of these jurisdictions, from Syrian to Serbian to Antiochian to Greek, all can connect. They are all united in one faith, orthodoxy, and they all believe the basic tenets. But here's the dilemma, folks. It's much easier not to be connected with people that we know are in such oppositional views than it is to gather people together who believe on the tenets of the faith, and then we just start discovering that our differences are cosmetic. It's much more difficult because we were so accustomed to opposing anybody who believed X. Now when we're with people who believe X, what in the world do you do when you start discovering that they have different haberdashers? I mean, suddenly we start elevating those things which are minimal expressions and make them maximum expressions. The Eastern Orthodox have been dealing with that for years. They can't even agree over whether those wonderful things are called pierogi or perohi. They still disagree as to the best way to cook lamb. In other words, the things that are important in the house are now elevated to situations because there's nothing left to argue about, ecclesiologically speaking, because they're all in communion with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And they all believe the same thing about Eucharistic doctrine. They all believe the same thing about Holy Scriptures. They all believe the same thing about, and the list goes on. And they're even all in communion with each other now. But that does not mean that they all get along. Because their ecclesiology, whereby they've been able to get to the point of an understanding of the same faith, occasionally allows the human element to enter. Have you been thinking a lot about Melchizedek lately? Apparently Greg was. And while it was certainly true that Greg was not going to next talk with me about ecclesiology, what Greg needed was somebody who represented Jesus because he wanted Jesus. And I want to tell you something, folks. It was not unique with John the Baptist determining what his role must be as he was to decrease. The world needs more of Jesus and everything that goes with proclaiming the truth of Jesus. And what it requires of us is more time looking enough at ourselves so that we live a life of personal holiness, so that we don't shortchange the people who need Jesus. More of him, less of us.